She was supposed to be on one bus, with a worn resume in her pocket and just enough change for the subway. Instead, the morning gave her two strangers on a bench and a decision that would not let her go. The bus stop sat under a grey sky, cold enough to make breath hang in thin clouds. A single flickering street lamp kept the shelter half lit, its yellow halo catching on a threadbare blanket. Anna Maria hugged the baby closer to her chest, the tiny warm weight of Isabela against her jacket. The girl's breath was steady, a small lullaby in the wind. Anna checked her watch. The interview was in an hour. Her phone read empty. The interview offer had been an opportunity, not a promise. On the bench beside them were two figures wrapped in layers of clothes. The man's coat was patched at the elbows. The woman's scarf had once been bright, but now was dulled by rain and dust. Both hunched forward, as if the bench itself were a kind of shelter against the cold. Their hands, veined, spotted with age, clasped each other's as if to lend warmth. Anna almost turned away. There are 1,000 small calculations a single mother forces herself to make. Rent, milk, bus fare, time. She had no place to stay if she missed the interview. No spare bottle of milk beyond the one she carried. But there was also a sandwich in her bag, half of which she had been saving for the subway. She unwrapped it, fingers numb, and offered it to them. "Please," she said, the words small and honest. "Take this. It's all I've got." The man looked up. He had the kind of face that remembered 100 things, a faint scar at the jawline, laughter lines carved like small roads. The woman's eyes, green, sharp even in their tiredness, studied her for a long breath. Then, slow as a sunrise, a smile unfolded, not triumphant but grateful. "You don't have to," she whispered. "But thank you." The woman's voice was thin, but there was dignity in it, a dignity that made Anna straighten. They ate together in wordless agreement. The bus groaned into view like a promise, and the little group rose from the bench, 3 strangers and a baby, as if stitched together by a single act. There was a closeness that comes from sharing warmth. Anna found herself saying, "You can come with me. There's a shelter 2 blocks from where I'm going. They can help for the day." "No," the woman began, then paused. We're waiting for our son. He's coming to pick us up." The man introduced himself in a voice the color of old wood. Francisco. The woman, Helena. Their names felt ordinary and full at once. They mentioned a small house on the east side, a son named Rodrigo who would arrive in time. They spoke of the neighborhood like people who had been part of it for years, and Anna, who had grown up not far from there, felt a small, almost dizzying recognition in the cadence of their speech. She shrugged it away as meaningless. A warm morning has 100 comforts that make the world feel familiar. She offered her seat on the bus to Helena. Francisco insisted she take it instead. She refused until he let her. No one noticed the way the bus smelled of oil and old upholstery, or the way the light through the windows painted everyone's faces the color of sepia photos. They rode together, 3 passengers who the city might have decided to forget. Isabela slept, her fist small and perfect on Anna's chest. For 30 minutes there was a quiet that felt like reprieve. Anna scanning the faces in the crowd, Helena tracing the seam of her scarf, Francisco checking the time on a watch that had slowed with use. At a stop downtown, the bus doors whooshed open and 2 uniformed officers stepped aboard. The arrest, or rather the accusation, came without warning. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you aware you're with 2 elderly people who may have been forced onto public transit?" one officer asked, his tone procedural, clipped. There had been a complaint. The complaint said a young woman was coercing 2 seniors. It said they were being taken somewhere against their will. Ina's heart slammed into a sudden hollow. Behind the officer, another rider, pale-faced, hands tucked into smudged pockets, stared at her with a look that could have been pity or curiosity or the simple satisfaction of watching a small scandal unfold. Passengers leaned forward, a girl in headphones recorded with a phone, her screen a pale rectangle of light. The bus felt smaller by the breath. "I know," Anna answered. "I asked them to come with me because they were shivering. I gave them food. My daughter is with me." Her voice cracked around the edges, part pleading, part incredulous. She put a protective arm around the blanket where Isabela lay, as if that would prove something. The officers asked to see identification. Helena's hands trembled as she fumbled through a leather purse. The papers they produced were straightforward. A marriage certificate in Helena's careful hand, a faded city ID for Francisco, a little photograph of a younger Rodrigo standing between them on a beach, a long-ago summer glossing the picture. The officer noted the names, the date of birth, the addresses. At the bottom of the form, in small official ink, a different address appeared. An address that, when the officer checked it against the bus company records, raised a second flag. Someone on the bus muttered, and the murmurs turned into a hum of suspicion. The initial report had been terse. 2 seniors abandoned at a bus stop. Anna's simple act of kindness had in one breath become the center of a claim. They escorted her off the bus, not with force, but with an insistence that felt like a thing gravity does when it proves a point. At the station, the bright lights made everything more exposed. Anna's hands were shaking so badly she had to set Isabela on a bench and re-wrap her in the blanket. She watched as the couple sat on a chair, hands clasped, the woman's fingers worrying at a loose thread. "You'll need to come with us to the station for questions," the officer said. There were forms to be filled, witnesses to be interviewed, statements to be taken. Anna felt the city tilt under her feet. Her bag, resume, a single unpaid ticket, felt suddenly obscene in its smallness. At the station, the fluorescent lights hummed an indifferent breeze. The desk officer took down names, times, and the protein of events. Anna told the story as best she could. The bus stop, the sandwich, the offer to share, the promise that someone would pick them up. She emphasized the baby, slow to mention that she had been headed to an interview, as if the detail might be used against her. The officers asked the elderly couple, Francisco, Helena, questions about their son. They said Rodrigo was expected. He'd pick them up, they insisted. The way Helena repeated the son's name, Rodrigo, with a softness that hinted at years of patience, felt like a private melody. But the officers' questions had a sharper edge. When was he supposed to come? Could they describe his car? Had they spoken to him that morning? "I think so," Francisco said, but then he looked off into the harsh light, and something slipped from his face. A cloud of confusion. He could not recall the exact time. He was uncertain about the address he gave. It was a small thing, the loss of a single puzzle piece, but in the hands of bureaucracy it grew. "Do you have a home phone?" one officer asked. "No," Francisco answered. "It's just the house, the old house." His fingers moved as if across the memory of a table, tracing a place that might not be where it had been. The interview turned the gentle morning into an interrogation. Someone called a social worker to the station, a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Vera, with a folder full of notes and a soft tone that did not soften the facts. She listened to Helena, who sometimes finished the social worker's sentences as though she could not always match her mind to the words. There were pauses where Helena's face seemed to drift, and small, sudden returns to clarity. Her eyes focused on the baby, then fluttered to Francisco with a frightened recognition. "Has she been evaluated recently for memory issues?" Dr. Vera asked. Yes," Francisco said. "She takes a pill sometimes. Sometimes she forgets the days." His voice held a weariness that felt like a confession. The officers exchanged glances. The station moved slowly, like water toward a drain. Anna watched as a detective, tall, with a belt that carried more weight than his voice, reviewed the IDs and took a single, careful photograph of the faded family portrait. He keyed a few things into his tablet, the light throwing little geometries across his face. "So," he said, meeting Anna's eyes, "do you know them? Do you recognize them?" For a moment, Anna's memory did a small, sharp pivot. The man's watch, a dented gold watch that had been sold at the corner pawnshop for years, the pawnshop where her neighbor Vicente used to run errands. The woman's scarf, the same pattern Mrs. Delgado had worn at the community center when she taught knitting, small echoes that belonged to the city's memory. But she had not known their names. She had not known how those echoes would widen. "Not really," Anna said. "I mean their faces. They look like people from around here." The detective nodded and took another slow breath. "We've had a report of a missing persons complaint associated with that address. The son, Rodrigo, has been contacted. He should be here soon." The name arrived like an extra weight. The bus had been a bridge. A name was an anchor. A few minutes later, Rodrigo appeared at the station. He did not stride in. He entered as a man who had been running, his hair a little disheveled, his voice frayed. He wore a jacket that had once been sharp and now sat on him like a borrowed layer. He carried a phone in his hand, which he fumbled through as if seeking a piece of himself. "Anna?" he said abruptly to no one in particular. Then, recognizing her, What are you doing here?" His eyes fell on his parents. For half a beat, the world rewound to a family photograph, the three of them on a summer beach, the sun low and golden. The present returned with an elasticity. Rodrigo's gaze sharpened, the responsibility settling in like an old suit. "You left," he said to Helena, sometimes to Francisco, sometimes at Anna, words brittle. "I called. What happened?" The conversation had the treacherous quality of an argument that was also a reveal. Helena blinked and looked small in the station lights. Francisco's hand, shaking a little, patted Helena as if to right a wobbling world. Rodrigo spoke quickly, his sentences threadbare with too much to say. "I called earlier. I was coming. I told you to stay." "What? Who is this woman?" His voice was more alarmed than accusatory, but the officers, trained to listen for gaps, noted the jagged cadence. "Sir," one detective said, with the professional politeness of someone who has heard 100 family storms, "we received a report that your parents were abandoned and possibly coerced onto a public bus. We need to clarify the situation." Rodrigo's shoulders hunched. For a moment, the station filled with a sound that was the hollowing of a man's chest, the breath before a confession or a lie. He said, "No, there's been a misunderstanding." Then, softer, "They were supposed to wait at home." That statement set off a series of small, metallic checks. The officers ran a quick search through public records, as one does with a map, looking for discrepancies. An address for the house showed up in a note, an owner name that matched Francisco and Helena's, but a recent sale had been recorded months earlier, the kind of line that doesn't make a case, but makes a query. "Have there been any changes at your parents' residence recently?" the detective asked. Rodrigo's eyes flicked away. He nodded once. "There was some paperwork. It was supposed to be handled. Things were getting complicated." His jaw tightened as if he could chew his way through what he didn't want to say. Anna watched all of this with the kind of clarity that comes when your life has already been trimmed to essentials. Every word here had the power to reshape her day. The officers kept their faces like thin masks. Someone arranged for Helena and Francisco to be evaluated, just to make sure they were not at immediate risk. Dr. Vera asked gentle, practical things, whether they had medication, if there were bank accounts, whether there was someone authorized to act for them. Rodrigo made a call on the bench, and the tone of his conversation came across like a poorly nailed plank. He used a word that was the wrong color for the moment, Transfer, he said, and then account, and then, later, debt. It was the way the word debt dropped into the air that made the station feel colder. The officers took notes. The world seemed to tilt very slightly, as if some internal balance had shifted. "You need to come down to the precinct," the main detective told Rodrigo. "We're just clarifying. Your parents are safe for now." Rodrigo's reply was an uneasy mixture of resignation and anger. "Fine," he said. "But they were fine. This is ridiculous." When the initial paperwork was done and the first set of interviews concluded, Anna found herself outside the station clutching Isabela, a cardboard cup of coffee cooling in her other hand. The city had resumed its pulse around them. Buses sighed, a dog barked, the wind stitched cold fingers through the crowd. It was then that she understood what the man's watch had been, the same watch that had hung in front of the little corner store where Vicente, the neighbor, kept a ledger of the neighborhood. Small things aligned like constellations. She thought of the photograph that had been on the couple's ID, Rodrigo as a boy, his arm thrown over his mother's shoulder, the sea behind them. The picture had been ordinary, 3 faces, a horizon. Something about it made her feel like the life they'd had once had edges she had not noticed until now. Inside the station, the questions continued to ripple outward. An officer slid a tablet across the desk with a small frown. "We'll need to hold the couple in a safe place for the day," he said. "There are reports of a possible dispute over their residency and assets. We don't suspect criminal coercion at this moment, but given the inconsistency in the accounts, we can't release them until we're certain." Ina's stomach dropped. "You can't," she started. Protective instinct is a thing that makes otherwise ordinary people attempt grand gestures. She thought of Isabela's tiny face and the way her arms instinctively shielded the baby. "They can go to the shelter where I was headed. I can watch them. I can help until this is cleared." The offer, when she made it, was practical and ridiculous simultaneously. Dr. Vera looked up from her notes, surprised and grateful. "If you're willing," she began, "it would help. We can register them and take an initial social history. We'd arrange medical checks. They'll be safe." Rodrigo listened, jaw set. He nodded, tight-lipped. Anna could read his posture. There was a man rearranging himself to accept a responsibility he'd been trying to avoid. "Fine," he said. "Do what's necessary." They took the couple to a shelter nearby, a small place run by a woman named Donna Celia, a stoic administrator who had the kind of hands that had folded hundreds of blankets and hardened into resolve. The shelter smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, with a kind of ordinary warmth that layered itself over worry. Francisco sat on a cot and removed his hat, while Helena curled into a chair with a blanket over her knees. The shelter's quiet routines offered small, precise comforts. A nurse came to check blood sugar, a social worker filled out forms that smelled of bureaucracy and paper, and Anna watched as Francisco's watch caught the overhead light and threw it back, a small rebellion. She signed a temporary agreement to help care for them until things were clarified, and for the first time that day allowed herself to think of the interview slipping like mist through her fingers. That evening, as light drained and the shelter's windows became rectangles of dark, people moved through the little kitchen. Plates clicked, a radio murmured. The couple ate slowly, as if savoring the idea of a meal rather than the meal itself. Anna sat nearby, Isabela asleep against her chest, and felt an odd, fierce tenderness that she would later struggle to justify. The thought that these 2 people, strangers that morning, already belonged in a story that now included her. Back at the station, routine grew into the beginnings of a paper trail. A detective called in a favor from the property records office and found a document that made him frown. A deed recorded months earlier listing the house as sold. The buyer's name matched a firm that had flagged some small suspicious transfers. The detective's voice over the phone had that flatness that meant the pieces were aligning into a puzzle that would demand more than curiosity. It would demand an investigation. By the end of the first day, a new cast of players had settled into the margins of Anna's life. Dr. Vera with her patient lists, a lawyer named Mariana who said she could help pro bono, a neighbor named Vicente who dropped off a box of old photographs and letters he'd found in the couple's stoop. Each offered small, necessary gestures. Each gave the impression of a community congealing. But the first, smallest, most decisive change had been Anna's, the single act of sharing a sandwich at a bus stop. It rippled outward like a stone into water, making small circles that reached further than she could see. That night, before she fell asleep in a chair at the shelter with Isabela curled against her chest, she replayed the morning's images, the bench, the watch, Helena's green eyes. She had done what she thought was right. Yet the headlines that were not yet written felt heavy with the sense that good intentions would not be enough. She dreamed of the photograph of the three of them at the beach and woke to a phone buzzing with a call she did not expect. Rodrigo, asking to meet with the detective again, this time at the precinct, insisting there had been an error. His voice carried an edge she could not place, something like fear, but threaded with a defiant protectiveness. In the days that followed, the investigation expanded like a shadow. It was not violence that pushed the story forward, but paperwork and numbers. Bank statements, wire transfers, deeds, signatures that some forensic analyst would later call questionable. An early review of the accounts showed transfers from the couple's savings into an account in Rodrigo's name. The amounts were not huge at first, but the pattern suggested something deliberate. There were mentions of offshore routing, of shell companies. The language was clinical and far removed from the bench where Anna had given away her sandwich. At the shelter, Helena cupped Isabela's tiny hand and smiled at the baby as if she were a lighthouse in a storm. Francisco, given a cup of tea, found a rhythm in small tasks, sweeping, tidying, like someone reconnecting to a life of ordinary days. Anna taught them the brand of formula she used, how to warm a bottle without a microwave, how to settle a baby in a carrier when the bus list meant she had to be on the move. Meanwhile, the detectives dug, and the world of paperwork suddenly had edges. A recent mechanic's invoice in Rodrigo's name, a credit card payment to a private clinic, phone records that placed him in a different city at a suspicious hour. Nothing was conclusive. Nothing yet painted Rodrigo as a villain in black ink, but enough lines were being connected to make suspicion plausible and urgent. One rainy afternoon, Vicente came to the shelter with a crate in his hands, and the look of a person who had stared long enough at the world to learn its secrets. "I thought you might want to see these," he said, setting the crate on a table. He lifted a photograph, one that showed Rodrigo, years younger, holding a set of keys in a grin that suggested pride, not malice. But tucked behind the photograph were envelopes, receipts, a stack of notarized papers with signatures that, when placed under light, did not quite line up the way a genuine signature should. They passed the papers around like relics. The lawyer, Mariana, took them with the gravity of someone opening a book whose first chapter was a warning. "We need to have these reviewed," she said. "If these documents show forgery or unauthorized transfer, it changes the whole case." Inna sat very still. The letters felt like artifacts from a life she had only just brushed. She had given away a sandwich and, somehow, stepped into a story that included deeds traded like chess pieces and money moved like smoke. The kindness she had offered had not only warmed two hands, it had made her a witness, perhaps the thin thread through which the rest of the story could be pulled. That night, as the shelter quieted, Francisco and Helena sat on opposite chairs, each holding a cup of tea. They spoke in low voices about the house and about a son who had changed over the years. Francisco's hands trembled at times, like leaves. Helena's words lagged and drifted, then snapped back into focus with a clarity that made Anna watch them with a new respect. They were not simply old. They were people who had been rearranged by choices not entirely their own. Outside, the rain clattered against the shelter's eaves. Inside, in the small square of light where the baby slept, Anna's reflection looked back at her, a young mother, pulled into a family she did not belong to by circumstance and compassion. She thought of the bus stop bench, of the threadbare blanket, of the watch that had caught the morning light. The detective's voice came again over the phone the next morning. "We've flagged multiple transfers," he said. "We need to speak to Rodrigo again. There's also the matter of some aggressive collection attempts he's had, loan sharks possibly. We suspect the transfers may have been used to cover gambling debts." Anna felt something like a current run through her, a mixture of dread and a strange, stubborn resolve. Rodrigo, her parents' son, had apparently been pushed into a corner where money moved like a tide. The idea of someone hunting him for debts had the coldness of a hunter's map. It explained in part the urgency that had been on his face when he first entered the station, a man trying to hold a life together under pressure he had not yet admitted. "You have a right to counsel," Detective Carvalho told Rodrigo when he arrived. "But we need clarity. If your parents' assets were transferred without consent, that's fraud. If you authorize transfers to cover personal debts, that's a different course. We're not making any determinations yet, Mr. Almeida, but we must investigate." Rodrigo sat there, folding his hands together like a man trying to keep the pieces of his life from scattering. He did not strike a heroic posture. He did not deny everything. Instead, he spoke in a way that suggested both culpability and confusion. "I'm trying to make it right," he told the detective. "There were mistakes. I thought I could fix things before anybody noticed. I panicked." The detective wrote it down. Panic is a word with the soft center of human failing. It is not the same as villainy. Anna watched the exchange with the same conflicted compassion Dr. Vera had shown earlier. She could see the line between responsibility and desperation, a man who had perhaps made choices he could not undo. When the meeting adjourned, Rodrigo left with instructions. Do not leave town, provide bank access if asked, meet with the social worker, and most of all, cooperate. The clerk stamped documents, signatures were taken. The process had the colorless efficacy of official work, wheels turning, checks made. It did nothing to simplify the bruised feelings at the shelter. That night, Anna sat outside the shelter alone for a moment, the night air bitten with cold. She cradled her daughter and watched the city exhale. The photograph of Rodrigo as a boy was already stored in someone's folder, to be traced and analyzed. The kindness that had started everything felt both fragile and brave. She did not yet know how dangerous the coming days might be, of men on the edges looking for money, of the lawyers and detectives who would pull at threads, of a crowd of strangers who would step into a life that had once been ordinary. She only knew that one morning, in a slow, careful motion, she had shared what little she had. That sharing had been an opening. It had become a doorway into other people's suffering, into responsibility, into a fight she had not planned on. And as she stood, a siren wailing distantly, Anna understood something that would thread through every choice after. Compassion multiplies. One small act sent ripples into a bay of consequences. She could not step back now. The question that would define the days ahead was not whether she had done the right thing. She had, but how much she was willing to cross when her kindness collided with a world of debts and forged signatures, of a son in trouble and parents who had been left alone. She lifted Isabela's blanket and kissed the top of her daughter's head. The baby smelled like milk and new beginnings. Anna told herself quietly that she would protect this smallness at all costs. Then she went inside, where the shelter's fluorescent lights hummed, and the next day's work began. Before we move on, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments while we keep going. They moved fast after that, the kind of hurry that feels both necessary and cruel. The documents Vicente handed over were scanned at the shelter under a single bright lamp. Yellowed envelopes, bank statements with wire trails that wound through small banks and then out to shadow accounts. A deed stamped and signed with a pen that hesitated in the wrong places under magnification. Mariana, the volunteer lawyer, read each sheet with a steady, careful fury. She labeled everything, photographed everything, and started a file that smelled faintly of old paper and cold coffee. "We have enough to request an emergency injunction," she told Detective Carvalho, who kept his face even and his eyes quick. "Not to convict anyone yet, but to freeze assets and block transfers. Then we'll move," Carvalho said. He worked the precinct like a man arranging chess pieces. He called in a forensic accountant, had the shell companies traced, and opened a formal criminal inquiry. The phrase "alleged fraud" appeared often in their notes, precise and guarded. For the first time since the bus stop, Anna had the odd sensation of being useful at a kind of planning table that had rules and outcomes. She watched grown-up decisions be made for people whose lives had felt carved into smaller maps than they deserved. Vicente came into the shelter with a black eye 3 days later and a bandage wrapped around his head. He'd been jumped coming home from the stoop where he'd retrieved the box. He'd tried to hide the crate in his apartment, then found a man waiting outside his door. The man had been polite enough. "You don't want these papers," he'd said, but then he hit Vicente hard when Vicente refused. Vicente kept his pride. He shrugged off sympathy and said quietly, "I did what I had to." He handed over the rest of his photos. Snapshots of Rodrigo Younger, receipts from a pawn shop, a yellowed note from a clinic, and then he sat down and would not speak for an hour. The shelter gave him tea. Donna Celia tied the bandage with hands that had steadied 1,000 small emergencies. The attack changed the tenor of the case. Up until then, the threat had been paper, accounts moved by numbers and signatures. Now there were men on the edges who wanted something. The police upped protection. Mariana filed for emergency relief to freeze the property sale and placed a hold on the proceeds. Detective Carvalho moved with a cautious speed. He was not a man to make a spectacle, but he was a man who preferred to be prepared. They planned a meeting to draw Rodrigo in and to secure his cooperation. The meeting was framed as a chance for Rodrigo to provide clarity and access to accounts. No dramatic arrests in public, just the sober business of law. They chose a small cafe 2 blocks from the precinct, a neutral place with frosted windows where people met for morning coffee, and the baristas knew most regulars by name. The idea was simple. Have Rodrigo come in voluntarily, speak in a public place, hand over the account passwords and sign consents. There would be an officer a few tables away, visible but not looming. Mariana would sit across the table with a stack of documents. Dr. Vera would be there to speak of the couple's care. Ina volunteered to be there as a witness. Her voice trembled when she asked, but she asked nonetheless. She would not be invisible to the story she had entered. It had been agreed the meeting would be calm. It had been agreed on paper. "Rodrigo is under a lot of pressure," Mariana told Anna the morning of the meeting. "Pressure will make people dangerous. That's why we have Detective Carvalho in a corner and 2 backup cars outside. Don't go in alone if it feels wrong." Her voice was both warm and frank. Anna nodded, feeling a weight she could not name. She fed Isabela, dressed her in a spare sweater the shelter had, and tucked a soft hat over her ears. The baby smelled of milk and the small chemical whisper of a new diaper. Anna felt fierce with the thought of protecting her, even as she wondered how to protect 2 strangers who had become like grandparents before she knew their names. The cafe smelled of espresso and cinnamon. Anna sat at a table near the door, Isabela in her lap, a paper cup of tea cooling beside them. Mariana leafed through the documents. Detective Carvalho tapped his phone and watched the window. On the sidewalk, life continued. A courier with a stack of boxes, a bicyclist weaving through traffic, a couple arguing softly. No one looked at them as anything but another small tableau in the city's long scroll. Rodrigo arrived late, as if his timing had been squeezed by an invisible hand. He carried himself with subdued attention, nervous but not yet unraveling. When he saw his parents in the shelter's photos on the table, his face folded and closed. He had come with a man who claimed to be a financial advisor, an older, smooth-faced fellow with a suit that smelled faintly of expensive cologne. The man took a seat at the edge of the table and said little. His hands were perfectly manicured. They started with paperwork, Rodrigo answering questions, Mariana asking for account numbers, the detective writing down what Rodrigo provided. For a moment, the meeting ran like a clean machine. Then the smooth man at the edge shifted. He whispered into his phone. Across the cafe, a waiter dropped a tray. A small, loud sound, metal clinking, set every head turning, and in one instant the world narrowed to the door. A smoke grenade exploded outside, a black, choking bloom that pushed its way through the cracked entrance when the gusty morning wind funneled it right into the cafe. People screamed and coughed and scrambled for the exits. In the chaos, a figure moved with a cold, efficient motion, 2 men, then 3, who seemed to know exactly where to go. They closed on Rodrigo like hands closing on a bird. One of them shoved a cloth bag over his head, and a kidnapper's leash snapped into place. They shoved him toward the door, toward the waiting van. In the hurry and the smoke, the man in the suit disappeared through the back, his elegance as effortless as a mask peeled off. Rodrigo was gone before anyone could do more than cry out. It felt like betrayal by gravity. Anna had been reaching for her phone to record the license plate. She had seen the men. She had not imagined they would take Rodrigo. She stood up, the baby in her arms, and the world turned mean and bright. Detective Carvalho drew his weapon with the slow professionalism of a man who has seen this movie before and knows where it usually ends. He barked orders. People moved. The baristas fled to the back, and the street outside filled with officers and a white sheet of panic. The kidnapper's van was gone. Rodrigo had been seized on a day when he was expected to cooperate. They searched until their shoulders ached. They traced the van to a warehouse at the edge of the industrial district, a squat brick place with no windows. It had been vacant for months and suddenly had lights. They tracked tire marks, paint chips, and a surveillance camera that had been turned away. The man in the suit had vanished. The men who took Rodrigo had faded into the city's corners. In the days after the abduction, the stakes shifted. What had been a case of alleged fraud had become one of abduction and extortion. Detective Carvalho assembled a team. They found a named link, a man the neighborhood called Silveira, an operator who worked the margins between debts and threats. He was a known associate of a collection ring that pressed people beyond what was legal and then sold their debts to worse people. In the ledger, they found at the shelter were entries that matched some of Silveira's known contacts. Silveira was not the one on the surface who wrote the contracts. He was the muscle who moved entries and made threats. Rodrigo was somewhere in their net. The police had probable cause to suspect that the transfers had been used to patch gambling debts, and now that he had been abducted, they had to act on 2 fronts, find him safe and use the papers to build a coherent case. They planned a sting to map the hideout. Anna insisted on staying close. She would not be pushed aside from a life she had already claimed by sharing a sandwich. The assault on the warehouse was a carefully coordinated effort. They had a warrant. They had surveillance. They had a man, Vicente, who had pointed out a certain delivery pattern that matched a schedule of silenced trucks. At dusk, uniformed officers took positions. Mariana and Dr. Vera were in a command van with the detective tracking feeds. Anna sat in the back with Isabela sleeping on her chest, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like shelter soap. Donna Celia had insisted on being there and would not be turned away. They breached the warehouse and found evidence of more: small beds, a whiteboard with names, a radio, a kettle. Rodrigo was there, skinned knees, a bruise along his temple, cuffed to a heavy pipe with a zip tie that had been cut ragged. He looked up when he saw the light and closed his eyes as if someone had pressed a finger into the black spot between hope and shame. He was alive, breathing, but hollowed into something small. The men who had taken him were not there. Someone had moved them out in the night. They found a ledger of names, payments, amounts, an account that matched the transfers from Francisco and Helena. They found photographs of deeds and notarized forms with stamps that came back as forgeries. There were guns stashed in a locker. The officers catalogued everything with slow, committed care. Then, as officers moved through a back corridor, a shout rose. Men had returned. A truck had circled back. The corner of the warehouse lit up in a flurry of motion. Silvera's men had thought they could retake the place. They did not. The raid became messy. A scuffle here, a shouted order there, a brief flash of gunfire that tore the air. Anna, who had clung to the edge of the operation because she could not be tossed away from the story she belonged to, saw a shadow move toward a side door. 2 men, cargo, then a small figure stumble through. In that instant she made a choice that would later be written about in polite, measured phrases. She stepped forward into a hallway with Isabela at her chest because a man with a mask reached for the baby. He thought the baby might bring leverage. It was a moment that matters like a turn of a key, the instinct to hold small life before him. Anna felt the world in slow detail, the smell of machine oil, the grit of concrete under her shoes, the baby's breath warm and trusting against her collarbone. And she moved. An arm swung, and the man struck at her. The blow missed the baby by an inch and found Anna's shoulder instead. The pain was immediate and hot, but the baby's cry filled the air and cut through it. Someone shoved the attacker away. A gunshot cracked and a man fell. Men were shouting and the room sped into focus, officers moving, the kidnapper network collapsing into a tangle of cuffs. Detective Carvalho reached them with a squad, and they cleared the space. The attack had been a desperate bid to recover documents, or to recover a bargaining chip, but the police had arrived. Anna crumpled to the concrete, Isabela still in her arms, warm and shrieking. She had a hole in her shoulder and a smear of dust across her cheek. Blood did not pour, but there was a sharpness that made everything else fall away. An officer carried her out and onto the back of an ambulance parked in a halo of sirens. Isabela screamed until a nurse wrapped her small, soot-smudged face and soothed her with practiced hands. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and the thin, patient music of monitors. Rodrigo was placed in custody as soon as he was cleared for transport. He was accused of fraud and other charges related to the transfers. He was also a victim of kidnapping. The legal paperwork gathered like an armor around him, papers that would be used both to hold him responsible and to protect him. The detective cautioned everyone on the gravity of labels. Accused does not equal convicted. In custody does not equal guilt declared. Still, cameras and the local papers fed the story like theater. Mariana moved carefully, aware that headlines could bite lives into easier shapes than reality deserved. Inna's wound required stitches and a night in the hospital for observation. She had a bullet graze that threaded a shallow path through her shoulder, nothing life-shattering, the doctor said in a pragmatic voice, but it would mean weeks of therapy and a scar that would remind her of how the day bent. The photographer's flash and the sympathetic looks came later. In the hospital room, she held Isabela and watched her breathe. The baby's fingers curled around a loop on her shirt, and Anna felt like a compass she could not recalibrate. Francisco and Helena were taken to a quiet room in the hospital where they could recover their sleep. Helena stared at the ceiling for a long time and then, with the simple bravery of small recoveries, held Isabela's tiny foot in her hand and hummed a song that Anna realized she knew from the crack of a neighbor's radio. It felt like a lullaby that had traveled through 100 kitchens and languages and knew the same words of comfort. The legal follow-through was complex and slow. Detectives executed search warrants on properties linked to Silveira and his front companies. Mariana filed emergency pleadings. The financial forensic team traced transfers to accounts that led to offshore nodes. Banks complied after notification. Some raised objections, others froze assets, while lawyers argued in their language of stipulations. Rodrigo's phone record showed calls to numbers linked with betting sites and to men identified as collectors. It was a tangle that painted him as both perpetrator and prey. Rodrigo sat in an interrogation room, and for the first time without smoke or men moving him like a puppet, he told the story in pieces. He admitted he had rerouted funds from his parents' account, saying he did it to cover mounting gambling debts. He described a spiral of shame and desperation, the kinds of late-night bets that promise absolution and deliver ruin. He said he had intended to replace the money, to make things whole again. He described a young man whose pride had muffled reason. He spoke of men who had backed his debts and who had come to him with their own threats. He was accused of fraud and faced charges. He was also, in a curious and painful way, asking for help. There was a scene that would be replayed in the months to come. Rodrigo in a room with Francisco and Helena, the three of them learning how to be together without the blunt instrument of blame. He sat with his head in his hands and said, "I am sorry," more than once. It was not a dramatic absolution. It was the small, raw center of accountability, words without escaping. Francisco listened with that steady, worn patience he had shown from the start. Helena's eyes shone with tears, but she offered him a cupped palm, as if to say in that small gesture that the line between harm and help could be bridged by honest repair. Rodrigo accepted treatment for his gambling addiction as part of a plea negotiation that Mariana shepherded with legal care. He enrolled in therapy and a rehabilitation program in the city, group sessions, individual counseling, financial literacy classes. He worked with a court-appointed counselor and, in time, began to speak with a quieter tone that suggested a man rebuilding his self-image one day at a time. He acknowledged wrongdoing. He agreed to restitution where it was possible. He began to meet with his parents, at first under supervision, then more openly, trying to reclaim something that had been lost. Silveira and several of his men were arrested in the warehouse raid and in subsequent coordinated operations. They were placed in custody and charged with kidnapping and other crimes related to their collection ring. Mariana and Detective Carvalho cooperated with prosecutors to build a case, and the materials from Vicente's crate and the warehouse became a portion of the evidence. The financial forensic team compiled a report that outlined the chain of transfers and exposed the shell companies that had hidden money flows. It did not overnight make everything clear. Legal systems move like glaciers, deliberate and inevitable. But it provided the scaffolding on which accountability could be built. The publicity that followed the raid brought donors. A local news segment framed the story in a human light. A young mother who found two elderly people at a bus stop and through an act of kindness became the axis of a larger fight against elder exploitation. People reached out with offers of help. One fundraiser, a quiet grassroots crowdfunding page, collected donations that arrived in small increments and then, miraculously, in larger waves. Local businesses offered job interviews for Anna, seeing a story of resilience and wishing to do what businesses can to help. There were offers of legal fees covered, offers of home goods, a local carpenter who said he would help build a porch for the family if they wanted it. Anna accepted help with the practical reserve of someone who has learned to be careful with favors. She took what she needed, funds for a down payment on a small house, donations for medical bills, a job offer at an NGO that provided services to seniors and families, an offer that felt like a circle closing because her act of compassion had brought her to that place. Donna Celia found a way to get Anna a paid position in the shelter's community outreach program while she learned the ropes. The NGO's director, who had watched the story unfold, offered training and a living wage so Anna could hold to the balance of mothering and work. The hospital stay turned into weeks of physical therapy for Anna and medical checks for the elderly couple. Isabela, who was only a baby, seemed largely untouched by the violence, except in the way small children can remember the pressure of being held during a shock. She slept and grew and smiled. Doctors said Anna would make a full recovery. They spoke in cautious, careful sentences and gave her a prescription for rest and a schedule of follow-up visits. Rehabilitation was more than the physical stitches. It was the lift out of fear from the limbs of a woman who had stood between harm and her child. The legal wheels continued their slow rotation. Rodrigo was charged and faced prosecution. He pled guilty to some counts and accepted programs as part of his sentence. The court records noted his acceptance of responsibility and his enrollment in treatment. The terms were technical and public, and they did not erase the many small consequences that would follow. In the coming months, he would meet with counselors, do community service, and participate in restitution efforts where possible. Mariana watched the legal process with a careful, wary hope. She wanted justice for the elderly couple and accountability for those who exploited them. In the quieter moments, the ones that do not make headlines, people mended. Vicente recovered enough to return to the stoop, where he kept tabs on the neighborhood. He patched the ledger and reshelved the photographs he had not yet handed over to the lawyer. He met Anna at the market and gave her an old brass key he had kept for years and said, "Keep it for your house." Francisco learned to thread a needle again and became the shelter's unofficial mender of clothes. Helena took to humming the lullaby to Isabela, and it hooked into the shelter like moss into stone. Anna's adoption by Francisco and Helena, an adult adoption filed with the court, was a legal process that honored the choice the three of them made to be family. It was not erasure or replacement. It was a recognition of ties formed not by blood, but by decision. The paperwork changed names on a page and gave Anna some legal standing she had not had before, the ability to be a recognized daughter, to be the person to make certain decisions if needed. For Anna, it was both symbolic and practical. It formalized a belonging she had felt since the bus stop. They used the crowdfunding money, together with donations from local churches and small businesses, to close on a modest house not far from the shelter. It had a worn porch and a yard with a patch of sun where a swing could be hung. Anna painted the living room in a pale, resolute blue. "Something calm," she said, and Francisco's watch, polished and set, hung on a hook beside the door. Helena planted a row of marigolds along the walk, proud and patient as the woman in 1,000 kitchens. Donna Celia came over with a casserole and a stern look that meant, "Now keep it together." The house was not a castle. It was a place where light stayed on, where laundry was hung, where a baby could cry without worrying the world would collapse. Rodrigo's recovery was not linear. He relapsed once, in small ways, and then came back with apology and a plan. He attended group sessions, and wearing the same hesitant honesty he had in the interrogation room, he began to take measure of what he had done. He did not step into the role of the repentant hero overnight. He took the work assigned, and he sat with the shame. He visited his parents, first in the shelter and later in the small house they now shared. There was a scene that Anna could not forget. Rodrigo in the kitchen, clumsily trying to make coffee for his mother, fumbling with the kettle like a man learning to be domestic again. It was funny and tender and ordinary in a way that felt like a small miracle. The legal case against Silvera and several men moved forward. They were charged with conspiracy, extortion, and kidnapping. Court proceedings took months, depositions and hearings, and the small, clinical cruelty of cross-examination. In the end, some were convicted and faced sentences commensurate with the charges. Others reached plea agreements. The court did not heal everything. No court could. But it did place a formal record and accountability that the neighborhood could point to. Mariana stayed with the case through every step. She grew quiet and a little indomitable, the way people do when they have been given a cause to anchor their life. In the months that followed, the shelter expanded a program to protect elders at risk. The NGO where Anna worked hired a case manager and began a neighborhood outreach program to educate families about financial exploitation, how to spot forged signatures, how to place holds on accounts, how to contact social workers. Anna's role was small and practical. She visited homes, taught simple steps, and told the story of a sandwich at a bus stop so people could see how small acts can cascade. She never framed herself as heroic. She said she simply did the obvious thing, but people found in that simplicity the courage to act. There were setbacks. The community found that exploitation had taken root in many small, stubborn ways. Some cases did not lead to prosecution. Some men slipped through legal nets. But the presence of a program to help elders made the neighborhood less of a prey ground. Vicente trained a small group of volunteers to look after at-risk neighbors. Donna Celia helped coordinate rides to doctor's appointments and to bank branches. The small mechanisms of care became a lattice that held a few more people. The first holiday after the house had been bought, Anna invited everyone. Francisco and Helena, Rodrigo, hesitant but present, Vicente, Donna Celia, Mariana, and the detective, who came with a pie and a level of private satisfaction that warmed him in a way no badge ever could. They sat around an old kitchen table and ate food that had been given and made and shared. Isabela, now toddling, made a mess of her plate and then walked over to Francisco and snatched at his watch with sticky fingers. He laughed and set it out of reach. Helena hummed the lullaby under her breath, and it stitched the moment into softness. Time did not fix everything. Anna still woke some nights with adrenaline that felt like a stranger in her veins. Rodrigo still checked his phone with a nervousness that did not disappear, but the acute danger, the men who had come to take him and to terrify others, had been taken out of the neighborhood. The papers had run a few human interest pieces that chronicled the rescue and the adoption and the crowdfunding. Some readers messaged angry comments. Others sent donations. A handful of people came by the shelter to volunteer. Life, in its stubborn daily practicalities, moved forward. Months later, when an adoption hearing was scheduled to finalize Anna's legal standing, the courtroom filled with small faces and some stern ones. There were no dramatic speeches, only papers and signatures, and a judge who asked the necessary questions. When the gavel fell, it brought a small, clean sound that seemed to mean more than a piece of wood. It meant recognition. Francisco took Anna's hand, and Helena hugged her like a woman who keeps everything she can in a pocket near her heart. They left the courthouse with a cake that someone had baked and a cardboard sign that read in shaky letters, "Welcome home." The final scene, the one that felt like the last frame of a long film, did not happen in a hospital or on a ledger or in a courtroom. It was quiet and domestic. It was a morning with light coming in through thin curtains, dust motes drifting like small planets. The kitchen table held a bowl of fruit and 2 mugs of tea. Isabela, now a little girl who reached up to the edge of chairs, played on the floor with a wooden toy while Anna washed dishes. Francisco sat in an armchair, his watch resting on the table beside him, and Helena stitched a small patch onto a jacket. Rodrigo came into the room with a battered satchel and a careful smile. He set it down and, for reasons that were neither grand nor small, he started to fix the swing on the back porch. They were not a perfect family. Perfection is the province of fiction, not of rooms where bills must be paid and conversations must be had about boundaries and trust. They were a family that had chosen each other. They argued about money, yes. They fretted about the future. They went to therapy, but they ate together. They shared chores. They took turns with Isabela when she woke in the night. They were, in the stubborn way a life can be, learning to be ordinary again. Years later, in a quiet moment on that same porch, Anna would point at the watch on Francisco's wrist and say, laughing, "You still need a new battery." He would smile and then shake his head and say, "No, I like that it still works with its dents. They're part of it." She would think about the bench at the bus stop, the threadbare blanket, the small sandwich she had offered, the moment it had been as ordinary as any other morning. She would remember the contemptible men, and the bright-faced officers, and the legal forms, and the courthouse. She would remember the way the city had felt like a place full of edges that could cut or hold, depending on who was there. That memory, simple and stubborn, became a kind of instruction. Compassion multiplies, she had learned. A small act of mercy had sent out ripples that altered lives, that exposed crime, that sent some men to prison and others to therapy. It made new family ties and new community programs. It did not make the world safe. It made the world a place where more people might be kept from harm. If this moved you in any small way, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Like, subscribe, and tell us one small thing you can do this week to help someone who may be unseen. What would your sandwich look like?